They wanted Roland Vance dead before the sun could rise over Baltimore Harbor. The very man he trusted more than his own blood had arranged that meeting alone, beneath the first snowstorm of the season, as it swept silently through the rows of darkened containers. To this entire underworld, his death would be nothing more. They wanted Roland Vance dead before the sun could rise over Baltimore Harbor. The very man he trusted more than his own blood had arranged that meeting alone, beneath the first snowstorm of the season, as it swept silently through the rows of darkened containers. To this entire underworld, his death would be nothing more than an unfortunate accident. A crime boss driving too fast down an icy harbor road, slamming straight into a slab of concrete in the dead of a winter night. The black SUV was forced off the lane, tore through the iron railing, and crashed into the wall of an old warehouse. The hood crumpled, smoke rising into the white curtain of snow. Roland slumped behind the wheel, barely breathing, his tailored suit worth more than an ordinary man's fortune now soaked in dark blood and glittering shards of glass. The pickup that ran him off the road backed up, then rolled away unhurried. Inside, Curtis Hale lit a cigarette, the small flame catching a face untouched by remorse. "Let the cold and the dark finish the rest," he murmured, then let out a quiet laugh. They believed it was over. They left the wreck to the storm, certain that by morning the name Roland Vance would freeze solid along with every secret he carried, and no one would remember the boss who had once made this entire harbor bow its head. They believed power had quietly changed hands in the night. But no, they were wrong. Wrong about everything. Because they had forgotten about the dog at the harbor. In the darkness between the rows of containers, a great hulking shape moved quietly toward the twisted metal. It was an enormous Neapolitan Mastiff, its ash-gray coat dusted with snow, its massive body marked with the scars of long, hard years scraping out a life on a harbor the world had forgotten. It stopped beside the crumpled car door, its breath rising in thin wisps against the cold. Inside, the man did not stir. The dog pressed its icy nose against Roland's blood-soaked hand hanging limp at his side. No response. It lifted its head to the night sky, and a long howl rose through the storm, deep, desperate, tearing through the silence of the dark like one last plea for a soul slipping toward death. And not far away, following the familiar shortcut along the docks, an exhausted woman had just stepped out of the diner after her final night shift. She pulled the collar of her worn coat tighter against the driving snow, her thin shoulders trembling in the cold, then suddenly froze. She had heard that howl. A poor waitress, carrying a lifetime of hardship on her shoulders, with no connection whatsoever to the world of the powerful and the cold-blooded. And yet her feet, for reasons she could not explain, began to turn toward that sound. She had no idea that in just a few minutes, she would step into a story that was never hers to carry and change everything. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and stay with us to the very end, because what happens next in that frozen darkness is something you will never see coming. The woman's name was Delia Mercer, and she had grown so used to the cold that she almost no longer felt it at all. But tonight, something was different. That howl didn't sound like a wild animal crying out in hunger and frost. It carried something she couldn't name, something so pleading that it made the soles of her feet go numb even more deeply than the snow. She walked around a row of rusted containers, and then she saw it. The black car sat with its front end crumpled against the warehouse wall like a wounded animal, one headlight still blinking faintly in its death throes, casting a weak glow over the thickly falling snow. The dog stood beside the car door, so enormous that, for the first second, she thought it was a bear. It turned its head and looked at her. It didn't growl. It didn't back away. It only looked, with deep, sorrowful eyes that seemed to have been waiting for her for a very long time. Delia moved closer, one step at a time, her breath coming fast behind her scarf. When she saw the man inside, she froze. He was slumped over the steering wheel, one side of his face pressed against the shattered glass, dark blood spreading across the collar of his white shirt and soaking down into the fabric of his expensive coat. Everything about him whispered of a world she had never set foot in. The watch gleaming beneath the snow, the polished leather shoes, the commanding weight that still clung to him even though he was unconscious. And then she saw it, the black grip of a gun jutting out from beneath his coat, right at his side. Her heart clenched. The hand she had been reaching out stopped in midair. A man like this, dressed like this, carrying something like this, wasn't the kind of man who simply had an accident and drove himself into a wall. This was the kind of trouble people like her were taught to avoid, to stay far away from, and never look back. In her mind, Posey's small face appeared with a clarity that hurt. The little girl was 5 years old, sleeping soundly in the cramped apartment on the other side of the city, under Mrs. Maggie's care. If Delia got involved in this, if something happened to her, what would that child have left in the world? She had already lost too much. She wasn't allowed to lose any more. Turn away, a voice inside her whispered, cold and practical. Turn away and pretend you never heard anything. Delia stepped back once, then again, and at that very moment, the dog made a small sound low in its throat, not a growl, but a soft whimper, almost like a plea. It stepped forward, lowered its head, gently caught the hem of her coat between its teeth, then let go and looked up at her again. The gesture was so simple that it broke her heart open. This huge, scarred creature, abandoned by the whole world in the freezing emptiness of the harbor, still refused to abandon the man who was dying inside the car. And then the memory came crashing back, the one she had buried for 2 years. The day they called her. The construction scaffold had collapsed. Her husband had lain there, beneath the steel and iron, for long minutes before anyone came. They said that if help had reached him sooner, perhaps he might have lived. She hadn't been there. She hadn't been able to do anything. And that guilt had slept beside her every night, heavy as a stone lodged in the center of her chest. She had promised herself, in the longest sleepless nights, that she would never, never again leave a person in need of saving behind just because she was afraid. Delia closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, the fear was still there, but something stronger had risen above it. She stepped toward the car, knelt beside the dented door, and pressed 2 trembling fingers to the stranger's neck. A pulse, faint, slow, but still there. He was alive. She let out a long breath, the white mist dissolving into the night. The dog stood close beside her, warm and solid, as if it knew she had finally made the right choice. "All right," she whispered, her voice hoarse, not knowing whether she was speaking to the dog or to herself. "I won't leave him here." Then she began trying to pull open the jammed door, her numb fingers gripping the icy metal, while the snow kept falling around the 3 lost souls stranded in the winter night. The door wouldn't budge. Delia pulled with the full weight of her body, both heels slipping over the frozen layer of snow, but the dented metal had clamped itself around the frame of the car like a trap. She changed direction, slipped her hand through the window where the glass had shattered wide open, felt around for the lock inside, and at last heard a harsh, grinding screech as the door opened into a narrow crack. The man was far heavier than she had imagined, an unmoving weight of flesh and bone and soaked clothing, and the moment she slid her arms beneath his shoulders to pull, she knew at once that she would never be able to do it alone. Her legs began to tremble, her breath breaking into white, ragged gasps in the air, and he barely moved a few centimeters. She was beginning to panic, beginning to think that perhaps she would have to leave him here and run for help, that by then it would already be too late, when the dog stepped forward. It clamped its teeth around the thick hem of the man's coat, right near the shoulder, planted all 4 paws against the ice-coated concrete, and began to pull. Its strength stunned Delia. That massive body lowered itself, every muscle tightening beneath its ash-gray fur, and the man's entire body began to slide out of the driver's seat with each firm, powerful tug from the animal. She understood her role immediately. She wasn't the one meant to pull. She was the one meant to support him, the one who had to keep his head from striking the ground, the one who had to slip her arms under his upper body while the dog carried almost all the remaining weight. Inch by inch, those 2 strange living souls dragged the man out of the wreckage and laid him stretched across the white snow. The dog didn't stop to rest. It released the coat, lifted its head toward a row of low warehouses only several dozen steps away, then turned back to look at her, its eyes so clear that no words were needed. This way, Delia understood. She slid both hands beneath the man's shoulders. The dog caught the hem of his coat again, and together they dragged him across that short stretch of yard, leaving a long trail pressed into the snow behind them. The warehouse door stood slightly open, its rusted hinges letting out a long, mournful cry, and inside was a darkness noticeably warmer than the world outside, sheltered from the wind, carrying the faint smell of rotting wood and old machine oil. This must have been where the dog had been taking shelter, because in one corner there was a pile of torn burlap sacks gathered into a nest, and a few half-gnawed bones lay scattered across the floor. Delia pulled the man close to the wall, lowered him onto the pile of sacks, then collapsed to her knees beside him, her chest heaving with exhaustion. She had no time to rest. Blood was still seeping from the wound at his temple, and another dark stain was spreading slowly across his coat near his ribs. She unwound her wool scarf, the only warm thing she had, folded it into a thick pad, and pressed it firmly against the wound on his head to stop the bleeding. Her hands worked quickly, with a strange kind of practiced skill, the kind learned through years spent in a scorching kitchen, where burns and sliced fingers were part of ordinary life. She tore a strip of fabric from the lining of her own coat and tied it around his head to hold the makeshift bandage in place. As she did all of it, her eyes never left the stranger's face. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps only a few years older than she was. But even in unconsciousness, that face still gave off a cold, commanding dignity, a hardness that didn't belong to an ordinary, decent man. An old scar ran along his jaw. His hand, though limp and bloodied, was still the hand of someone used to giving orders, not obeying them. And then her gaze slid once more to the grip of the gun at his side, and the question she had been trying to push away all this time rose back up, larger now, more persistent. Who was he? What had been done to make a man like him lie here, dying in this deserted harbor, in the middle of a snowstorm, abandoned like a piece of trash no one cared enough to claim? And more importantly, would the people who had done this come back? Delia shivered, not entirely from the cold, then tightened the bandage around his forehead and silently prayed that she had just saved a human life, not invited death itself into her own. When the blood on the man's forehead had finally stopped seeping and his breathing had grown a little steadier, Delia sat with her back against the cold warehouse wall, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself to breathe out very slowly. Her hands were still trembling, not only from the cold, but from an exhaustion that had soaked all the way into her bones, the kind of weariness she had carried for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to rest. Her shift had ended less than an hour earlier, her second straight shift of the day, and both of her feet were still aching inside the shoes with worn-down heels. Mrs. Maggie's diner stood on the edge of the harbor, a small place with windows always clouded by steam, and the smell of coffee warmed over again and again, where Delia waited tables from afternoon until deep into the night, smiling at long-haul drivers and lonely souls who came in searching for warmth more than food. Every tip she managed to collect, bill by bill, was smoothed flat and carefully tucked into the old tin box at home, because not a single dollar of it was extra. There were months when she had to choose between the heating bill and medicine for her mother, the woman who had once worked herself to the bone to raise her and was now growing weaker by the day in the small back room. And every time Delia had to make that choice, another small piece inside her broke apart. The debt from her husband's funeral was still there, clinging to her like a shadow that refused to fade, growing larger with every added number of interest she didn't even dare to look at directly. 2 years earlier, he had still been here, still smiling at her across the breakfast table, still promising her that better days would come. Then, in one cruel instant, tragedy struck, and all those promises were buried with him beneath the cold concrete. Since then, she had learned how to become everything at once: the mother, the daughter, the one who held the household together, the one who was never allowed to fall apart, because if she fell, there would be no one left to catch their small family. At that thought, her heart twisted again with a raw, aching need to see her child. By now, the image of Posey filled her thoughts, her golden blonde curls and a smile that showed the sweet gap of a missing baby tooth. And Mrs. Maggie always brought her up to the apartment on the nights Delia worked late. Mrs. Maggie had no children of her own, and she loved Posey like a granddaughter, often baking butter cookies for her and telling her fairy tales until the child's small eyes grew heavy. Every morning when Delia came home, she always found her daughter curled up safely beneath a warm blanket, and that image alone, was the only thing that gave her enough strength to keep moving through each day. The little girl was the reason she woke up every morning, the reason she smiled even when there was nothing to smile about, the small, pure light in the middle of a life that had already known too much darkness. And now, sitting here in the dim warehouse beside a strange man who carried guns and secrets, Delia suddenly felt afraid, in a very different way. It wasn't fear for herself alone, but fear that the choice she had made tonight might bring consequences her daughter would have to bear. She looked at the unconscious man, then at the dog lying low beside him like a breathing stone statue standing guard, and a thought flashed through her mind, bitter and strangely honest. Perhaps all three of them, the woman worn down by the weight of life, the man abandoned by his own kind, and the stray dog forgotten by the whole world, were alike in one way. They were all trying to survive this night, and none of them had anyone left to cling to except themselves. She pulled the collar of her coat higher, shifted a little closer toward the dog's warmth, and decided she would stay until the man woke, though the unease inside her still hadn't faded over what might be waiting for them all when morning came. It wasn't until close to dawn, when the first pale gray light began to slip through the gaps in the warehouse roof, that the man finally moved. At first it was only a faint crease of his brow. Then his fingers curled slightly, and Delia, who had drifted off sitting with her back against the wall, startled awake and quickly shifted closer to see whether he needed anything. That was her mistake. The instant her hand touched his shoulder to reassure him, the man's eyes flew open, and everything happened so quickly that she had no time to react. His hand, which only moments earlier had been hanging limp and motionless, shot up like a trap snapping shut, his fingers clamping around her wrist with a force astonishing for someone who had just come back from the edge of death. He wasn't panicked at all. That was what sent a chill down her spine. An ordinary person waking in a strange place after nearly dying would have cried out, struggled, been afraid. This man did not. His gray eyes, though still clouded with pain, swept across the room at once, taking in every exit, every shadow, every possible threat, with the cold composure of someone used to calculating along the thin line between life and death. Then that gaze stopped on her face, sharp as a blade. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse from dryness but still carrying a low, heavy authority that made every word press down on the air. "What is this place?" Delia tried to keep her voice from shaking, though her wrist was aching beneath his fingers. "My name is Delia," she said, slowly and clearly, the way someone speaks to an animal backed into a corner. "I found you in a wrecked car out by the harbor last night. You almost died. I brought you in here to keep you from freezing. You're safe." She said the last words with deliberate gentleness, but he didn't loosen his grip. His eyes narrowed, examining every line of her face, searching for some sign of a lie, of a trap, of any reason not to believe her. And in that moment, she understood that this man lived in a world where kindness didn't exist, where every act came with a price, where no one did anything for anyone else without calculating what they would get in return. He was waiting for her to make a demand. "Why?" he asked, and that single word carried an abyss of suspicion inside it. "Why did you save me?" Delia didn't answer right away. She only looked straight into those cold eyes, and instead of feeling the fear he seemed to expect from her, she felt something rise in her chest that was almost pity. "Because you're a human being," she answered softly, "and you needed help. That's all." The answer seemed to unsettle him more than any threat could have. He blinked, and for the first time, a brief flicker of hesitation crossed his hardened face. At that exact moment, a low, muffled sound came from the darkness. The dog had awakened. It stepped out from the corner of the warehouse, its massive body casting a long shadow across the floor, and walked straight toward the two of them. It didn't growl at Delia. Instead, it lowered itself right between her and the man, head held high, its calm eyes fixed on Roland as if to say that this woman was not an enemy. Roland went still, his gaze shifted from her to the dog, and something in his expression wavered slightly, as though the sight of that huge, scarred animal had brushed against some hidden place inside him that even he had forgotten still existed. The hand gripping her wrist slowly loosened. He let his head fall back against the pile of burlap sacks, his breath heavy, the pain in his ribs clearly draining what little strength he had left, but his eyes still didn't leave her. "You're a stranger," he said, his voice dropping until it was almost only a whisper, "and strangers don't save people without a reason." Delia quietly rubbed the wrist he had just released, then answered, "Maybe you just haven't met the right stranger before." For a long while, Roland lay still, letting her words settle into the cold warehouse, and Delia could see clearly that he was trying to rearrange his world according to a logic he could understand. A man like him didn't believe in kindness without reason, because all his life, it had never been given to him. In his world, every act of help was an investment, every favor was a rope meant to bind, and whoever reached out a hand was only waiting for the moment to collect a profit. So he did the only thing he knew. He reached into his soaked coat, and though every movement made his face tighten with pain, he still managed to pull out a thick leather wallet. "Take it," he said, pushing it toward her with fingers that were still trembling. "There's more in there than you make in an entire year. Take it, forget my face, forget tonight, and never tell anyone you saw me here. That's how things work. You helped me, I pay you. fair and clean. He said the last words with cold certainty, as if it were an obvious truth of the universe, as if he were offering her a privilege that anyone else would have seized at once. Delia looked at the wallet lying on the pile of burlap sacks, then looked up at his face. She knew the money inside it could change everything. It could pay off the funeral debt that was choking her month after month. It could buy enough medicine for her mother to last through the whole winter. It could put on Posey's table the meals the child deserved to have. For a moment, only a moment, her hand gave the faintest movement. But then she thought of the reason she had stepped into this warehouse in the first place, thought of the promise she had silently made in the middle of the snowstorm, that she would never abandon a human being, simply because she was afraid, and she realized that if she took that money, she would turn what she had done last night into something else entirely. It wouldn't be help anymore. It would become a transaction, and she had endured too much loss in her life to sell away the one small thing she had left that still made her herself. She pushed the wallet back toward him, gently but firmly. "I didn't save you for money," she said. There was no anger in her voice, no wounded pride, only a calmness that gave her words even more weight. "I saved you because last night, if I had walked away and left you to die in that car, then this morning I wouldn't have been able to look my daughter in the eyes anymore. This has nothing to do with who you are or how much money you have. It has to do with what kind of person I am. Put your wallet away." Roland stared at her, and for the first time since waking, the cold vigilance in his eyes gave way to something else, a real and profound confusion, almost a kind of shock. He had lived nearly his whole life among people who could be bought, threatened, or used, and he had become skilled at reading all of them with nothing more than a glance. But this thin, exhausted woman in a worn and threadbare coat had just refused something half the city would betray one another to possess, and she did it not to bargain for a higher price, but simply because she believed it was the right thing to do. That was outside every pattern he had ever known. It made it impossible for him to place her in any compartment within the world he had built to protect himself. "You're not afraid of me?" he asked softly, almost testing her. Delia thought about it for a moment, then answered honestly, "I am. I'm afraid. But I've learned that there are things more frightening than a stranger carrying a gun, and one of them is becoming the kind of person who turns her back and walks away when someone is dying right in front of her." Roland said nothing more. He only lay there, staring up at the rotting warehouse ceiling, and in that silence, something very small, very deep, something he had buried for so many years, stirred for the first time. The silence stretched on, and as the pain in his ribs carried him wavering between consciousness and oblivion, Roland's mind drifted back to a place he had spent many years trying to forget, this very harbor, but from a time that felt impossibly distant. He had grown up here, among the narrow, muddy streets behind the warehouses, where the smell of sea salt and rotting fish blended into the only air his childhood had ever known. His mother worked in a packing house by the water's edge, a thin woman with calloused hands that stayed cracked all year from the cold water. A woman who still came home every night with her back bent from exhaustion, yet always saved a tired smile and a bedtime story for her little boy. They were so poor that on some nights dinner was nothing more than a scrap of bread split in two. But she had never allowed him to feel starved for love. Then everything collapsed. An organization that controlled the harbor in those days began tightening its grip on the workers, cutting wages, forcing them to labor under conditions even animals wouldn't have endured. And when his mother and a few others dared to speak out, they punished her in the coldest, cruelest way. They took away her job. They made sure no one in the entire harbor district dared to hire her. They left her to fight hunger, cold, and a sickness that worsened by the day without a single dollar for treatment. Roland, only a boy then, had watched his mother fade little by little, had held her icy hand in a wretched room with no heat, and had learned the bitterest lesson of his life, that in this world, the powerless had no right to live with dignity. People would crush you, step over your body, and no one would look back. The day his mother died, something inside that little boy died with her, and what rose in its place was a vow as cold as winter ice, that he would never, never let himself be weak again. He would become strong. He would climb to the top of the very world that had destroyed his mother, and from that height, no one would ever be able to touch him again. And he had done exactly that. Step by step, through one harsh year after another, the skinny boy from the harbor had forged himself into Roland Vance, a name the whole harbor would one day whisper with unease. But amid all the ruthlessness he had learned, one thing still remained, something he never admitted to anyone, a private code he had made for himself. He could be cold, he could be merciless with his enemies, but he never forgave those who preyed on the weak. Whenever he saw some thug bullying a poor shopkeeper, some powerful man crushing someone who had no way to fight back, he saw the shadow of the men who had killed his mother, and he punished them without mercy, as though each time he were avenging the woman who had died in that cold room years ago. It was the only way he knew to keep his soul from rotting completely. And during those lonely years when he wandered the harbor as a boy, when no one bothered to care about a ragged child, there had once been a creature who shared that loneliness with him, a huge stray dog that guarded the warehouses, and he used to secretly leave it the few scraps of food he had. The memory flashed and vanished, faint as an old dream, and Roland, sinking slowly back into unconsciousness, had no idea that it was about to return to him in a way he could never have imagined. When Roland woke again, daylight had filled the warehouse more clearly, and the first thing he saw was the dog lying low only a few steps away from him, its calm eyes fixed on him without looking away. In the daylight, he could finally see it clearly. A massive Neapolitan Mastiff, old and scarred, with the loose, wrinkled skin of its breed and ash-gray fur that had faded with the years. Something about this animal kept pulling at him, a vague sense of familiarity he couldn't name, like an old melody suddenly rising from some distant place in memory. He frowned, trying to push back the fog in his head, and then his gaze stopped on the animal's right side. There, hidden beneath the gray fur, was a unique white marking running along its ribcage. Roland's breath caught. He had seen that distinctive mark before, a very long time ago, from a life he thought he had buried forever. He braced a hand against the floor and forced himself partly upright despite the sharp pain in his ribs, studying the animal more closely now, this time not with the vigilance of a predator, but with trembling disbelief. The torn piece missing from its left ear, the particular way it lay slightly on one side. And those eyes, those sorrowful amber eyes that seemed to hold an entire deep sea of forgotten years. "It can't be," he whispered, his voice breaking into a sound he barely recognized as his own. "It can't be you." But he knew, with a certainty deeper than reason. He knew. This was the son of the stray dog from all those years ago, inheriting that exact same white marking and those sorrowful amber eyes. It was as if the loyalty of the mother dog he had fed as a skinny boy had passed down to this giant creature, waiting to repay the debt. The dog had once been the only creature in the world that didn't look at him with contempt, didn't chase him away, didn't ask anything of him except a little warmth and a piece of food shared in silence. So many years had passed, an entire lifetime, and somehow it was still here, still wandering this harbor that the whole world had abandoned, surviving one winter after another like a loyal ghost that refused to leave. And last night, it was that very dog, that very animal, that had pulled him back from the hands of death. Roland's throat tightened in a way he hadn't felt in years. The man who had once made an entire underworld tremble, the man who had never allowed anything to shake the ice around him, now sat in a rotting warehouse with his eyes burning before an old dog. Slowly, he extended his uninjured hand toward it, palm turned upward, the same gesture the boy he had once been used to make when he placed a scrap of food on the ground for it. The dog looked at that hand for a long while. Then, slowly, it rose, took heavy steps toward him, and did something that made Roland's hardened heart melt completely. It lowered its head, pressed its huge muzzle into his palm, then laid the whole massive weight of its body down beside him, close against him as if trying to give him warmth, as if after all those years apart, it still recognized the boy who had once been kind to it in a world with no mercy at all. Roland rested his hand on that great head, stroking the scarred gray fur. And in that quiet moment, without the need for a single word, an invisible thread was tied again between two living beings whom life had once cast aside. "Brutus," he called softly, using the very name the boy he had once been had given it. And the dog gave a faint wag of its tail, as if it had spent an entire lifetime waiting to hear that name again. Delia, standing silently in the corner of the warehouse, watched it all without a word, and she understood that this cold man carried far more inside him than she had ever imagined. It took 3 days before Roland had enough strength to sit up without seeing the warehouse sway before his eyes, and the moment his body allowed it, the old self inside him returned at once, cold, sharp, and full of calculation. Delia had reluctantly brought him a cheap phone she had hurriedly bought at a convenience store, after he convinced her that it was the only way to keep both of them safe and she stood watching him with unease as he pressed numbers he knew by heart. The first call was very brief. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't waste words. He only spoke his own name in a voice so calm it was chilling. And on the other end of the line, Delia heard the sudden silence. The silence of someone who had just heard the voice of a man who should have been dead. "I'm still alive," Roland said quietly, "and I want to know everything." That was all. He hung up, and in the hours that followed, that cheap phone began to vibrate steadily with messages, names, and fragments of information sent back from an invisible network he had spent years building. Delia watched him work with silent astonishment. He never left the warehouse. He didn't need to. With nothing but his voice and his name, he made people all over the city scramble, made them open their mouths and reveal things they had hidden, made them bow their heads before a man sitting on a pile of torn burlap sacks in an abandoned warehouse. It was a kind of power she had never witnessed before, a power that didn't need fists or weapons, but moved through the darkness, quiet and absolute, like invisible strings pulling an entire vast chessboard into motion. And piece by piece, the picture of Betrayal began to appear. The one who had arranged for him to go to that fateful meeting that night, the one he had trusted more than blood, was Curtis Hale, his right-hand man, the man who had stood beside him for nearly 10 years. Roland sat motionless for a long while when that name was confirmed, his face showing no emotion at all, but the knuckles tightening around the phone said everything. Betrayal by a stranger was ordinary enough, but betrayal by someone he had once considered a brother was a different kind of wound, deeper than the physical trauma still racking his broken body, but he didn't allow himself to sink into that pain. Instead, he kept following the threads, and what he discovered made the whole picture clearer and more merciless than ever. Curtis hadn't acted alone. He had joined hands with a powerful real estate corporation called Harborcrest Holdings, a force with bottomless pockets and cold ambitions, hungry for the land where the old harbor district stood. They wanted to erase this entire area, flatten the aging warehouses, drive out the poor small merchants and working people who had clung to this place for generations, and raise gleaming towers for the wealthy on that ground. Roland stood in their way. He was the only one powerful enough to protect the harbor, the last wall between the vulnerable and the crushing machine of money, and that was why they needed him to disappear. Curtis had sold him out in exchange for a seat in the new world Harborcrest had promised. When Roland fitted the final piece into place, he lifted his head and looked through the dusty warehouse window, where the old warehouses stretched beneath the cold gray sky. The very harbor that had given birth to him had killed his mother, and was now being threatened by the same ruthless greed from long ago. Something cold and hard settled in his eyes. "They thought they had buried me," he said softly, almost only to himself, but Delia still heard him. "They're about to regret not doing it properly." And in that freezing warehouse, for the first time since that fateful night, Delia felt the true weight of the world she had accidentally stepped into. The truth came to Delia late one afternoon, not from the man she was hiding in the warehouse, but from Mrs. Maggie. She stopped by the diner to pick up a little leftover food and check on Posey as usual. And when she accidentally mentioned that she was caring for an injured man down by the harbor, Mrs. Maggie asked a few questions, then pressed her further about his build, his face, the scar along his jaw. The kind woman's face suddenly went visibly pale. She seized Delia's wrist, lowered her voice in fear, and told her the name no one in this entire harbor district dared to say out loud: Roland Vance, the kingpin who ruled the whole underworld of the harbor, the man surrounded by rumors like fog, the man people both feared and avoided. A name tied to power, money, and things that honest people like them never wanted to be involved in. Delia stood frozen in the warm kitchen of the diner, feeling as if the ground were swaying beneath her feet. For the past several days, she had been bandaging that man's wounds, bringing him food and water, sitting with him in the dim light of the warehouse. And all that time she hadn't known, she was hiding one of the most dangerous men in the city, only a short distance from her little daughter. She returned to the warehouse that very night, and this time her footsteps no longer carried the tenderness of the previous days. "You're Roland Vance," she said, her voice trembling not from the cold, but from a rising storm of anger tangled with fear. "You're the harbor kingpin, and you let me care for you for days without saying a single word about who you really are." Roland didn't deny it. He only looked at her with those calm gray eyes, and that calmness made her even angrier. "You didn't ask," he answered quietly. "Don't," Delia cut him off, her voice breaking. "Don't speak to me that way, in that cold way. as if everything is a chess game and everyone is just a piece on your board. Do you know what I risked when I brought you in here? I have a daughter, a 5-year-old daughter who has no one in this world but me. If the people hunting you come here, if they find out I hid you, do you know what will happen to her? Her voice caught in her throat, and the tears she had been holding back all afternoon finally rolled down her cheeks. I saved you because I believed saving a human life was the right thing to do, she went on, softer now, but with even more pain. But I never agreed to have your whole world placed over my daughter's head. I want you to leave. As soon as you're strong enough, I want you to get out of here and never come back. Roland was silent for a long while, and within that silence, something shifted faintly across his face, something she had never seen in him before. Not coldness, not calculation, but real remorse, quiet and deeply buried. You're right, he said at last, his voice sinking lower. I should have told you. I'm sorry I put you and your daughter in danger. That wasn't what I wanted. He stopped, then added the thing that surprised her most. And I promise you, whether you believe me or not, that I will never let anything happen to that little girl. Not because you're helping me, but because there are lines even a man like me will never cross, and hurting a child is at the very top of that list. Delia looked at him through her tears, and though every piece of reason inside her was screaming that she shouldn't believe the word of a man like him, there was something in his eyes, a bare and unguarded honesty, that made it impossible for her not to believe him. And with a confusion she couldn't begin to name, she realized that the man sitting before her was not entirely the monster the rumors had made him out to be. Trouble came to Mrs. Maggie's diner on a morning that had seemed peaceful. Delia was wiping down the familiar tables when 2 strange men walked in, and from the very way they pushed open the door, took possession of the space, and swept their cold, searching eyes across the diner, she knew they hadn't come in for a meal. They wore neatly tailored dark suits, the kind of clothing that looked out of place in a working-class diner, and they carried the arrogance of men who believed money could buy everything. One of them sat down at the counter and tapped his fingers slowly against the wood, while the other walked straight toward Mrs. Maggie, who was standing behind the kitchen pass. "Dear owner," he said in a voice so sweet it was false, "we represent Harbor Crest Holdings. Our corporation has a wonderful development project planned for this entire area, and we would like to offer to buy the valuable piece of land where your diner is located. A very generous price, of course." Mrs. Maggie, the woman who had stood firm behind that counter for nearly 30 years, wiped her hands on her apron and answered calmly that this diner wasn't for sale, that it was her whole life, and that no amount of money could replace what this place meant to the small community around the harbor. The smile on the man's lips vanished. The false sweetness fell away, revealing what lay beneath it, cold and full of threat. "I don't think you understand your situation," he said, his voice lowering. "This isn't really an offer. The harbor is changing, whether you want it to or not. Those who are sensible and leave early will walk away with a full pocket. As for those stubborn enough to stay," he left the sentence hanging with deliberate meaning. Then, with one rough sweep of his hand, knocked the glass rack from the counter to the floor, sending the drinking glasses shattering with a crash at Mrs. Maggie's feet. "They'll find their lives becoming very, very difficult." Delia hurried forward and stood in front of Mrs. Maggie by instinct, her heart pounding hard. But her eyes didn't look away. "You don't have the right to do this," she said. The 2 men looked her up and down with contempt, then laughed. "The waitress would be better off minding her own business," one of them said. "Before you get dragged into things you shouldn't be involved in." They left, but before stepping out the door, one of them deliberately knocked a stack of clean plates onto the floor, leaving his final warning scattered in broken pieces of porcelain. When the door closed, Mrs. Maggie stood frozen in the middle of the diner, her shoulders trembling, and for the first time, Delia saw that strong woman look small and afraid. "They won't stop, sweetheart," she whispered, lifting a hand to wipe her eyes. "I've heard about the other places. They come, they threaten people, and if folks refuse to leave, then bad things start happening." That night, when Delia told Roland everything in the warehouse, she saw his face darken. He listened to every detail, from the name Harbor Crest to the threat they had made, and she realized that all of it had locked together in his mind into one single picture. "It's them," he said quietly. "The same people who paid Curtis to kill me are now tightening their grip around the people in this harbor, one by one." He fell silent for a long while, and Delia could see the struggle taking place behind his eyes. He was still weak. His wounds had not fully healed, and the smartest thing he could have done was disappear from the city, recover, then return later to settle his debt in his own way, at the right time. That was how a man like him had always acted, coldly, with calculation, never allowing emotion to interfere with decisions that involved survival. But when he looked up at the tired face of the woman who had risked her life and her daughter's safety to save a stranger like him, something inside him refused to leave. "She gave you a roof over your head, didn't she?" he asked. "The woman who looks after your daughter." Delia nodded. Roland looked down at his hand for a moment, then raised his eyes again, and now there was a cold resolve in them. "Then they've just made a mistake," he said. The enforcers came back to Mrs. Maggie's diner the next afternoon, exactly as Roland had predicted, this time in greater numbers and with more aggression, certain that the fear they had planted the day before had been enough to break the stubborn old woman. What they hadn't expected was the man sitting in the corner of the diner, his back to the door, his hat pulled low to hide his face, quietly taking a sip of coffee like any ordinary customer. The moment the leader began his familiar threat, Roland set his coffee cup down on the table, and that soft sound somehow rang through the diner like a warning bell. He stood. He turned around, and the instant his face was revealed beneath the lights, all three men froze as if they had been turned to ice. One of them stammered his name, his voice breaking with terror, because all of them had believed Roland Vance had been dead and frozen at the bottom of some ditch for days. "Seeing you boys so scared," he said, his voice low and so calm it was chilling. "It seems someone told you I was no longer in this world." He walked toward them without any hurry, each slow step landing on the floor, and that unhurried calm was more frightening than any burst of rage. The largest man, recovering a little of his courage, lunged forward with a raised fist, but Roland only shifted slightly to one side with the smooth ease of someone who had known this kind of thing since boyhood, then used the man's own momentum to send him sprawling across a row of tables, dragging a crash of broken dishes and overturned furniture with him. Though the wound in Roland's ribs still throbbed and his body had not fully recovered, the strength radiating from him didn't come from muscle alone. It came from something else, from absolute coldness, from the authority of a man who had never learned to retreat in his entire life. The second man pulled out an iron bar, but Roland was already in front of him before he could swing it, locking the man's wrist in one decisive motion, twisting it behind his back until the iron bar fell to the floor, then leaning close to his ear to whisper a few words that only he could hear, words that turned the man's face white. The third man didn't even bother resisting anymore. He only backed slowly toward the door, both hands raised in surrender. Roland released the man in his grip and let him drop to his knees, gasping for breath, then stood straight in the middle of the wrecked diner and swept his icy gaze over all three defeated men. "Listen carefully," he said. And though his voice wasn't loud, every word was clear and cold as ice. "This diner, this woman, and every person in this harbor district, from this moment on, are under my protection. Anyone who still dares come here to threaten people who can't defend themselves will answer directly to me. And I promise you, that isn't a conversation any of you wants to have. Go back and tell the ones who sent you that Roland Vance is still alive, and he's very angry." The three men didn't need to hear it a second time. They fled from the diner, stumbling over one another at the threshold, disappearing into the cold street so quickly that the leader even left his hat behind on the floor. When the last sound faded, a strange silence settled over the small diner. "Mrs." Maggie stood behind the counter, one hand pressed to her chest, looking at the man who had just protected her with eyes full of shock and gratitude. Delia, standing at the kitchen doorway, had seen everything, and a complicated feeling rose inside her, one she could barely name. She had seen the danger in him, the cold power that could send larger men running. But she had also seen what he used it for, not to take, not to rule, but to shelter an old woman who had nothing to repay him with. Roland picked up the abandoned hat, placed it neatly on the counter, then turned to Mrs. Maggie. "You won't be bothered again," he said, and this time his voice had softened greatly. After that day, a quiet change took place between them. Mrs. Maggie, with her grateful heart and generous nature, insisted that the man couldn't go on recovering in that freezing warehouse forever, and she arranged for him to stay in a small room behind the diner, warm and discreet. It was there, on an afternoon when snow had begun falling softly again outside the window, that Delia did something she hadn't planned at all. She cooked him a meal, not reheated leftovers, not something thrown together just to fill a stomach. but a pot of hot chicken soup, made from scratch, with golden slices of buttered bread she had toasted with her own hands. When she set the steaming bowl of soup down in front of him, Roland looked at it for a long while without touching it, and something strange passed across his face, an expression Delia needed a moment to understand. It was bewilderment. The man who could have bought any expensive dish in the city, who had sat in the finest restaurants, was sitting in silence before a simple bowl of chicken soup, because he realized that it had been a very, very long time, perhaps not since his mother was still alive, since anyone had cooked a meal for him not out of fear, not to flatter him, not to trade for something in return, but simply because they wanted him to have something warm in his belly. "Thank you," he said softly, and those two words came out with difficulty, as if he were learning again, a language he had forgotten long ago. Just then, the room door swung open, and a small figure came running in. Posy, with her golden blonde curls and cheeks flushed pink from the cold, had just been brought over by Mrs. Maggie. The little girl stopped short when she saw the strange man, her round eyes studying him with curiosity, and for one anxious instant, Delia felt her heart tighten with a mother's instinctive worry. But then something happened that surprised her. Brutus, the huge dog lying beside Roland, lifted his head and looked at the little girl, and Posy, who seemed to have no idea what fear was, let out a delighted cry and rushed straight over. Roland, in a natural gesture that even he hadn't expected from himself, picked up a piece of meat left from the meal and gave it to the little girl, showing her how to place it on her tiny palm and hold her hand flat so the dog could lick it away. Posy burst into giggles when Brutus's large tongue tickled her palm, and that clear laughter rang through the small room like a ray of sunlight breaking through winter clouds. "Your dog is so big," the little girl exclaimed in wonder. "He's like a giant teddy bear." And then, with the innocent logic of childhood, she decided that a man who knew how to feed a dog couldn't be bad. She rummaged in the pocket of her little coat for a moment, then pulled out her most precious treasure, a smooth round pebble of pale green she had found by the bay and always carried with her. "This is for you," she said, placing the pebble into Roland's large palm with all the solemn dignity of a priceless gift. "It's my lucky stone. I'll lend it to you so you won't hurt anymore." Roland looked at the small pebble resting in his palm, the same hand that had once held enough power to terrify an entire city, now trembling before the innocent gift of a child. He, a man who had spent his whole life spreading fear, a man no one dared approach unless driven by terror, had just been trusted, without condition, by one small living soul. Not because of who he was, not because of what he possessed, but because the child had seen something good in him that he himself had forgotten still existed. He closed his fingers around the pebble, and when he looked up at Delia standing in the doorway, his eyes shimmered with a light she had never seen there before. "Thank you," he said to the little girl, his voice gone hoarse. "I'll take very careful care of it." And in that warm moment, no one in the small room knew that the real storm was drawing near. News of the 3 enforcers fleeing Mrs. Maggie's diner spread quickly through the city's underground streets, and when it reached Curtis Hale, he shattered the glass of liquor in his hand right at the desk of the elegant office he had only recently taken for himself. Roland Vance was still alive. That name, which should have been buried beneath snow and darkness, was now returning like a ghost come to collect a debt, and Curtis knew better than anyone what that meant. He had betrayed a man who never forgave betrayal. He had put his hand into a gamble, from which only one of them would walk away alive. Panic rose inside him, but Curtis wasn't an ordinary fool, and instead of letting fear swallow him whole, he turned it into cruelty. He called the people backing him at Harborcrest, and during that tense conversation, a cold plan was drawn. This time, there would be no more petty intimidation, no more low-level enforcers sent to smash up a diner. This time, they would tear the problem out by the roots. Curtis had spent days having his men follow the trail, and little by little, he found out where Roland was hiding, and also discovered the woman who had saved and sheltered his enemy. When he learned about Delia, about Mrs. Maggie's diner, about the small network of people who had protected Roland, a cold smile spread across his lips. This was the weakness he needed. Roland Vance alone was a wolf who couldn't be driven into a corner, but a wolf with things to protect was a wolf who could be wounded. That evening, a call came to Roland's phone. Curtis's voice sounded from the other end, smooth and falsely triumphant. "Old friend," he said, "I hear you're harder to kill than I thought." Roland didn't answer. He only listened in silence, and that silence made Curtis continue, each word like a poisoned blade. "I know where you are. I know about the kind waitress who dragged you out of the wreckage. I know about the little diner and the stubborn old woman who owns it. How touching. A fallen kingpin taken in by the desperate and the poor. His voice suddenly hardened, stripping away every trace of false warmth. Listen to me, Roland. I'll give you until dawn to come to me yourself, alone, unarmed. You come, everything ends cleanly, and none of your pathetic new friends gets hurt. You don't come, then I'll have to pay them a visit. And I'm not known for being gentle. The line went dead. Roland stood motionless in the darkness of the room, the phone still pressed to his ear, and for the first time since that fateful night, Delia saw real fear appear in his eyes, not fear for himself, but fear for the people he had begun to care about. He turned toward her, and without needing him to say anything, she read the gravity on his face. "He knows everything, doesn't he?" she whispered. Roland nodded, and then, without a second of hesitation, the first thing he thought of wasn't himself, but the little girl. "Posey has to leave here immediately," he said, his voice firm enough to allow no argument. "Take her somewhere safe, as far from the harbor as possible, tonight." Mrs. Maggie had relatives in a town on the other side of the city, and within 1 hour, amid a quiet urgency, Posey was wrapped warmly in a blanket and placed in a car, her sleepy little eyes completely unaware of the storm moving toward them. The little girl only had time to wave goodbye to her mother through the window and remind Roland to take good care of the lucky stone. Then the car rolled away, carrying Delia's most precious thing to a place Curtis's hands could not reach. Only when the taillights disappeared fully into the night did Delia turn back to face Roland. And both of them understood that now, there was no way back. Curtis had no intention of waiting until dawn. The meeting was only a trap meant to make Roland lower his guard. And as soon as the night had fallen at its thickest, Curtis's men quietly surrounded the area around the diner. Brutus was the first to sense that something was wrong. The dog, which had been lying still, suddenly sprang up, the fur along its neck standing on end, and a low, deep growl rose from the depths of its throat, aimed toward the darkness beyond the window. Roland understood the signal at once. He had only just managed to pull Delia into a hidden corner when figures rushed in, and then the smell of smoke began to creep into the room. They had set fire to the old warehouse next door, but the roaring flames quickly spread to the diner, licking along the dry wooden walls of their sanctuary. Before long, an entire corner of the harbor was blazing in an angry red light. Smoke billowed upward, hot, burning, and suffocating. And in the chaos of that sea of fire, Curtis stepped out, his face lit by the flames until it looked like a mask of cruelty. "You hid yourself well, Roland," he called out. "But I told you, I always find what I need." The two men who had once been brothers rushed at each other through the thick smoke, and it was a confrontation between men who knew each other down to the bone, every blow carrying the weight of years of trust now turned into hatred. Roland still hadn't fully recovered, and the old wound in his ribs made every movement feel as if his flesh were being torn open. Curtis, knowing that too well, attacked that weakness without pause. In the moment Roland staggered backward, Curtis seized the chance, drew a knife, and lunged forward with all the madness of a man who knew he had no way out. Delia screamed a warning, but everything happened too fast. The blade came down toward Roland while he was off balance, and in that life-or-death instant, a massive ash-gray body flew through the air. Brutus. The old dog had thrown itself between the blade and the man it regarded as its savior, using its own scarred body as a shield. A cry of pain rang out, not from a human being, and Brutus collapsed onto the floor, but it didn't let the attacker go. With all the strength it had left, it clamped its jaws around Curtis's knife arm, dragged him down, and held on without letting go, giving Roland enough time to force himself back up. That desperate, courageous act from the animal changed everything. Roland, seeing the dog that had saved his life twice now falling because of him, felt something ignite inside him even more fiercely than the flames around them. He surged forward, tore the knife from Curtis's hand with one decisive move, and hurled him to the floor. The struggle was brief and brutal, but righteous fury gave Roland a strength Curtis couldn't match. Within moments, the traitor lay motionless at his feet, completely subdued, every last trace of resistance gone. But Roland had no mind left for him. He spun around and dropped to his knees beside Brutus, who was lying on the floor, barely breathing, as the smoke grew thicker by the second. The fire was spreading fast, and Delia, despite her fear, ran to him and helped him lift the dog's heavy body. "We have to get him out," he shouted over the roar of the flames, And the two of them, the man who had once ruled the harbor and the woman who had once been only a poor waitress, carried the heroic animal together through the sea of fire, out of the collapsing diner, and into the freezing night outside. In the distance, the sirens of fire trucks and police cars had begun to sound, tearing through the stillness of the winter night, drawing closer with every passing moment. They laid Brutus down on the soft snow, far from the flames, and when Roland looked down at the old dog struggling through each heavy breath, the eyes of the man who had once seemed impossible to shake filled with tears for the first time. On the white snow, far from the roaring flames, Brutus lay there, the massive body that had once been a living shield now trembling with each fragile breath. Roland knelt beside the dog, his hands, so used to power and coldness, now shaking as they moved over the ash-gray fur streaked with soot, not knowing what to do, not knowing where to place them in order to hold on to this fading life. "Hold on," he whispered, and the voice of the man who had once made an entire underworld bow its head broke into fragments. "Hold on, old friend. You don't get to leave me now. Not after everything you've done." The dog's amber eyes opened faintly, searching for his face through the smoke, and in that moment, a whole lifetime of devotion seemed to gather inside that silent gaze. It had found him in the wrecked car on a snowstorm night, when the whole world had abandoned him. It had guarded his sleep in the freezing warehouse, and tonight, it had placed its own life between him and the blade of death without a single second of hesitation. All because, so many years ago, a poor and lonely boy had shared his few scraps of bread with it, in a world that had no mercy at all. Roland bowed his head and pressed his forehead against the dog's great head, and for the first time in his adult life, that man wept. Not restrained tears, but the choking sobs of a soul that had been frozen too long finally beginning to thaw. Delia knelt beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and she couldn't stop her own tears either. The two of them remained there in silence beside the heroic animal, amid the sirens drawing closer and closer, while the snow kept falling quietly, as if trying to cover everything with a white burial cloth. For one long, suffocating moment, Brutus lay motionless, its eyes closed, and Roland felt as if his own heart had stopped with it. The whole world seemed to freeze. The fire, the night, the distant voices calling to one another. All of it receded into an empty silence full of despair. He had come too late, just as he had once come too late to his mother's sickbed years ago. Now he was powerless again, watching a living soul he loved slip from his hands. But then, in that grief-stricken stillness, a small miracle happened. The dog's broad chest rose faintly, one breath. Then another, a little deeper, and from its throat came a soft sound, not the mournful howl from that fateful night at the harbor, but a small, relieved whimper, almost like a greeting, as if it were trying to tell him that it still refused to leave. Roland jerked his head up, unable to believe what he had just heard. "He's still breathing," Delia cried out, her voice breaking open between tears and joy. "Roland, he's still breathing." At that very moment, the rescue workers and the veterinarian Mrs. Maggie had managed to call came rushing over, and in the urgent rush of hope, they carefully lifted the dog, examined the wound, and confirmed what the two of them had not dared to dream. He was badly hurt, terribly hurt, but that brave heart was still beating, and if he received treatment in time, he would live. Roland rose to his feet and helped Delia up, and together they watched as the dog was carried away beneath the flashing lights, their hearts filled with something neither of them could name, something that was pain, gratitude, and a fragile but real hope all at once. The man who had once believed everything in this world could either be bought or taken now stood among snow and ashes, understanding that the most precious things sometimes came from places he had never imagined, from a stray dog at the harbor, and from a woman who had never asked him for anything. Curtis Hale lay restrained there among the snow and ashes, his hands bound tightly, and when Roland stepped forward to stand before him, a heavy silence covered the scorched yard. All his life, Roland had known only one way to deal with traitors, and that way had never involved the law or a courtroom. Now, standing before the man he had once considered a brother, the man who had sold him out, nearly killed him, set fire to his refuge, and almost cost his loyal dog its life, every instinct built up through years in the underworld screamed inside him for immediate and brutal revenge. Curtis deserved it. No one in this harbor district would dare breathe a word about it. That was the law of the game Roland had lived by his entire life. Curtis seemed to be waiting for exactly that as well. He looked up at him with a twisted, bitter smile and said quietly to go ahead, to finish it, because that was the only way men like them knew how to end a story. Roland stood motionless for a long time, his fist tightening and loosening again, and in that torn moment, he saw two roads stretching out before him. One road was the old version of himself, the man who solved everything with blood and fear, the man who would remain forever chained inside the vicious circle of violence that had destroyed his entire life. The other road was something he had never dared to step toward. He thought of Delia, the woman who had refused his money just to hold on to her conscience. He thought of the small green pebble a child had placed in his palm with unconditional trust. He thought of the old dog fighting for its life. The animal that had taught him loyalty and kindness could still exist even in the darkest places. And he understood that if he killed Curtis tonight, he would only prove that his whole life he had never truly been any different from the men who had killed his mother all those years ago. When a police officer named Owen Brennan, who had been tracking the shadowy dealings around the harbor for a long time, arrived at the scene beneath the flashing lights, Roland did something that stunned everyone who knew him. He didn't run. He didn't destroy the evidence. Instead, he walked over to the officer and handed him something. It was all the evidence he had quietly gathered during the days he spent recovering in the warehouse. Every hidden transaction, every dirty payment, every thread connecting Curtis Hale to Harbor Crest, and to the plot to seize the harbor by any means necessary, including murder and arson. "Everything you need to bring them into the light is here," Roland said, his voice calm but firm. "Do what should have been done a long time ago." Owen Brennan looked at the man before him with astonishment, because this was something he had never expected from someone like Roland Vance, and when he took the file, he understood that he was witnessing something rare. The true atonement of a human being. Curtis was led away that night, and with the evidence Roland had handed over, the entire Harbor Crest network began to be exposed. Powerful people sitting in elegant offices were named one after another, and the plot to erase the harbor district and the poor people who lived there was finally stopped. When everything settled, Roland stood in the harbor as the smoke and fire were slowly brought under control, and he understood that the decision he had made that night had changed him forever. He could have taken revenge the old way, but he had chosen to let justice speak in his place. And in that choice, for the first time, he felt truly free, released from the invisible chains that had bound him since the day his mother died. "I'm going to leave that world behind," he said softly to Delia when she stepped up beside him. "The world that turned me into someone I no longer want to be. I don't know what lies ahead, but I know I don't want to go back down the old road." That winter eventually passed, and when the last snowflakes melted away to make room for the warm sunlight of early spring, the old harbor district began to wear an entirely new face. Roland had kept his promise. He used all the wealth he had gathered through so many years in the shadows to do something the man he used to be could never have imagined. The warehouse that had burned down on that fateful night was rebuilt from the ground up. Not into the cold high-rise towers Harbor Crest had once coveted, but into a warm, common home for people whom life had forgotten. There were clean rooms for poor workers with nowhere to go, a large kitchen always filled with rising steam where Mrs. Maggie volunteered to cook hot meals, and even a wide yard for the abandoned animals found around the harbor to be rescued, healed, and given a second chance. People called the place by a simple name, Harbor Haven, and before long, it became a bright lamp in a neighborhood that had once been swallowed by darkness. Brutus, after many weeks of devoted care, recovered in a miraculous way, though his steps were slower now, and one side of his body carried one more scar. The old dog became the soul of the place, lying in the sun at the doorway day after day, quietly welcoming every person and every creature who came there, as if he understood better than anyone what it meant to be saved when it seemed the whole world had turned away. The children in the neighborhood loved him dearly, and no one loved him more than Posy. The little girl, now safely back with her mother, often ran to throw her arms around his great neck every afternoon, telling him all sorts of things in her clear little voice, and Brutus always listened patiently with gentle eyes. Delia's mother, who was moved into a warm room at the shelter, also gradually grew stronger under careful care, and for the first time in many years, Delia felt the burden on her shoulders being shared. Between Roland and Delia, a quiet affection began to bloom. Not hurried, not loud, but peaceful, like water finally finding its way home. They didn't rush to name what they felt for each other, because both of them understood that wounded hearts needed time to learn how to trust again, and they had an entire future ahead of them to do that. The man who had once ruled the harbor through fear now found the meaning of his life in small things: a shared meal, a child's laughter, the wag of an old dog's tail, and the gentle gaze of the woman who had not abandoned him when the whole world had. And if there is one lesson left behind by this story, it is that unconditional kindness carries a power that money and authority can never buy. Sometimes, the person who needs saving the most is the one who appears strongest, and sometimes, the one who saves us isn't a great hero, but simply an ordinary person kind enough not to turn away. Never judge a person only by their past or by what they seem to be on the outside, because in every soul, no matter how dark it may appear, there is always a spark of light waiting to be awakened by love and kindness. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like, and share this video so that together we can listen to many more meaningful and deeply moving stories every day. How do you feel about the story of Roland, Delia, and the old dog at the harbor? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear your voice.